Every time you explain yourself to someone who has already decided to misunderstand you, a small piece of your peace dies quietly in the exchange. You feel it happen. The words leave your mouth, reasonable and measured, and you watch them land on a face that was never going to change its expression, no matter what truth you offered it, and still you continue. You add another sentence, you clarify, you justify. You reach for one more example, hoping this will be the one that finally makes them see, finally makes them understand, finally makes them agree that you are not what they think you are. This is not communication. This is bleeding. Consider what is actually happening beneath the surface of over-explaining. It looks like confidence. It looks like someone standing their ground, offering evidence, defending a position with articulate precision. But listen closer, and you will hear something else entirely. The frantic scratching of a mind that cannot tolerate being misunderstood. Beneath every unnecessary justification lives a quiet, desperate question. If this person walks away believing the wrong thing about me, will I still be able to believe the right thing about myself? That question, asked silently 1,000 times a day, is the root of nearly all modern anxiety. It is the invisible tax levied on anyone who is confused being understood with being whole. Look closely at where this tax is collected, and you will find it hiding in the smallest corners of your daily life. It is there in the text message you type and retype, softening a sentence that was already true, adding a smiling face to a statement that needed no apology, rereading it 4 times before sending, then checking obsessively for a reply that will tell you whether you have been forgiven for a crime you never committed. It is there in the meeting where a colleague misrepresents your work, and you spend the rest of the day composing, in your head, the perfect rebuttal you will probably never deliver. It is there in the friendship that has grown cold for reasons never spoken aloud, where you find yourself replaying old conversations, searching for the exact sentence that ruined everything, as though understanding the wound could undo it. None of this looks like suffering from the outside. It looks like diligence, like conscientiousness, like someone simply being careful with their words. But underneath, it is the same ancient reflex wearing modern clothing, the belief that if you just choose the right words, in the right order, at the right time, you can purchase back a version of yourself in someone else's mind. You cannot. That mind was never a shop you could bargain in. The Stoics knew this trap intimately, because they lived in a world that offered even fewer protections from public judgment than ours does now. Epictetus, born a slave, stripped of nearly every external freedom a man can be stripped of, arrived at a realization that would become the spine of his entire philosophy. Other people's opinions of you are not yours to control, and therefore they are not yours to carry. He did not arrive at this gently. He arrived at it because he had no choice, because the alternative was to spend a life in chains twice over, once in body and once in mind. And from that necessity came one of the most liberating instructions ever spoken aloud. It is not events that disturb people, but their judgments about events. Someone thinking poorly of you is an event. Your suffering over it is a judgment. You built that second part yourself, brick by brick, defense by defense. What is rarely spoken of when this teaching is repeated is how violently it must have fought against Epictetus's own instincts to arrive there. To be falsely accused and say nothing is not a natural state for a human being. It goes against something ancient in us, some deep evolutionary alarm that equates being misjudged by the group with being cast out of it, left alone and unprotected. Every fiber of the body wants to correct the record, to raise its voice, to insist on its innocence. Epictetus would have felt that same pull, the tightening in the chest, the words rising in the throat, demanding release. His discipline was not the absence of that impulse. It was the refusal to obey it. He trained himself deliberately and repeatedly to pause in the space between the accusation and the response, and in that pause to ask a single question: is this something within my power to control? If it was another person's judgment, the answer was always no, and so the impulse, however strong, however justified it felt in the moment, was allowed to rise and pass without being fed. Here is the uncomfortable truth beneath that truth. Silence terrifies the untrained mind because silence removes the illusion of control. When you explain yourself, you feel as though you are steering the outcome, shaping how you are perceived, correcting the record, managing the narrative. But this is mostly theater performed for an audience of one. The other person's mind was never a stage you could direct. It was always sovereign territory, governed by its own histories, wounds, and biases, most of which have nothing to do with you at all. The moment you accept this, something shifts, not comfortably, sharply, like a bone resetting. You begin to see that every word spent defending your image to someone determined to misread you was a coin spent on a debt that was never truly yours. Now consider the alternative. Consider the person who has done the interior work of separating what belongs to them from what does not. Someone insults them, misjudges them, spreads a version of them that bears no resemblance to the truth, and they do not reach for a rebuttal, not because they are weak, not because they lack the words, but because they have located, with total clarity, where their responsibility ends. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire surrounded by flatterers and enemies alike, wrote to himself in the dead of night that the best revenge is to not be like your enemy, to simply continue being who you actually are, undisturbed, unmoved, unbothered by the noise trying to provoke a reaction. This is not passivity. This is the single most active form of self-governance available to a human being. The refusal to let your peace be auctioned off to the highest bidder of public opinion. This is what silence becomes once you understand it correctly. Not avoidance, not weakness, not defeat. It becomes sovereignty. It becomes the closing of a door that other people kept trying to walk through uninvited. When you stop over-explaining, you are not surrendering the argument. You are withdrawing from a courtroom that had no jurisdiction over your soul to begin with. And in that withdrawal, something remarkable happens. The anxious hum that used to follow you into sleep, replaying conversations, rehearsing rebuttals for arguments that hadn't even happened yet, it begins to fade. Because you are no longer feeding it. You are no longer handing your evenings over to people who spent no more than a passing thought on you before moving on with their lives, untouched, while you lay awake constructing defenses for a trial that was only ever happening in your own mind. But knowing this and living it are two very different disciplines. It is one thing to understand the dichotomy of control in the quiet safety of reflection. It is another thing entirely to hold that understanding steady. When someone you love looks at you with disappointment, when a stranger insults you publicly, when the silence you have chosen is mistaken for guilt by people eager to believe the worst. The real test of this rule is not found in comfortable moments. It is found in the ones that make your hands tremble and your jaw tighten with the old familiar urge to explain, to defend, to be understood at any cost. What happens in you in that exact moment, that is where the next rule begins. What happens in that trembling moment, chest tight, jaw clenched, words already forming on your tongue, is not weakness. It is the oldest battlefield a human being will ever stand on, and almost no one is taught how to fight on it. You imagine the war is out there, in the accusation, in the insult, in the disrespect thrown carelessly in your direction. It is not. The real war is fought in the half-second between the provocation and your response, a half-second so brief most people never even notice it exists, let alone that it can be won or lost. And here is the rule that follows from that recognition, harder to practice than almost any other. You are not responsible for the impulse that rises in you. You are entirely responsible for what you do with it. Notice, honestly, what happens inside you when you are wronged. A surge, heat behind the eyes, a tightening in the hands. This is not a moral failure. It is biology, ancient and automatic, the same current that once helped a creature decide in an instant whether to fight or flee a predator in the dark. The Stoics never denied this current existed. They were not advocating for numbness, for a cold absence of feeling dressed up as wisdom. What they discovered, through relentless self-observation, was something far more useful. Between the impulse and the action, there is a gap. Narrow, often less than a second wide, but real. And within that gap lives the entire discipline of a well-lived life. Epictetus called the faculty that governs this gap the ruling center. The part of you that receives every impression the world throws at you and decides, consciously or not, whether to grant it authority over your behavior. Most people never learn this faculty exists, and so they live as though every impression that arrives must be obeyed the instant it appears. An insult arrives, and they insult back before the sentence is even finished. A delay arrives, and fury follows before the reason for the delay is even known. They mistake the speed of their reaction for the strength of their character, when in truth it reveals the opposite. A mind with no gatekeeper, letting anything that knocks walk straight through the door. Marcus Aurelius, of all people, understood how difficult this gatekeeping truly was. Here was a man with more reason than almost anyone in history to react instantly and without restraint, an emperor who could have any offense answered with total impunity, any slight avenged before sundown. And yet the private notebook he kept, never intended for other eyes, is filled again and again with the same quiet instruction to himself. When you rise in the morning, remember that you will meet people who are ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, and remind yourself before the day even begins that none of this has the power to disturb you unless you hand it that power yourself. He was not writing this because it came naturally to him. He was writing it because it did not. Every entry is evidence of a man rehearsing, over and over, a discipline that fought against his own nature. This is worth sitting with. The most composed man in the ancient world was not composed by temperament. He was composed by repetition. This is the part modern life makes almost unbearably difficult, because modern life is engineered, quite deliberately, to close that gap entirely. A notification arrives, and you are expected to respond within minutes. A comment appears beneath something you posted, and the platform itself seems to vibrate with an urgency demanding immediate reply. Every design choice around you is built to shrink that half-second of space until it disappears completely, because a reactive mind is a profitable mind. It clicks, it argues, it stays engaged. And so the very gap the Stoics spent their lives trying to widen is now the exact target of every system competing for your attention. Reclaiming it is no longer just a personal discipline. It has become, quietly, an act of resistance. Consider what actually changes when you learn to hold that gap open, even briefly. Someone speaks to you with contempt, and instead of matching their tone, you feel the old impulse rise, recognize it, and simply do not obey it. In that pause, something extraordinary happens. You stop being a mirror for their behavior and start being the author of your own. This is not suppression. Suppression is swallowing the reaction and letting it curdle inside you, only to surface later as resentment or illness or an outburst over something unrelated and small. What the Stoics practiced was not suppression but examination, looking directly at the impulse, naming it honestly, and then making a conscious choice about whether it deserves to become an action. Often it does not. Often, once truly seen, an impulse that felt enormous a second ago reveals itself to be small, almost embarrassing in its pettiness, unworthy of the energy it demanded. There is a particular kind of strength that comes from this practice, one that looks from the outside almost indistinguishable from calm. But it is not calm in the passive sense. It is closer to the stillness of someone holding a great weight without visible strain. Effort deliberate, chosen fresh, in every single moment it is tested. And it is tested constantly, in the sharp comment from someone you love, in the driver who cuts you off without a glance, in the message left unanswered for days that your mind fills, uninvited, with 100 wrong explanations. Each of these is not an interruption of the discipline. Each of these is the discipline showing up disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. But widening that gap between impulse and action is only half the work. The other half is far more unsettling, because it asks you to look honestly at what you are actually afraid will happen if you stop reacting at all. If you let people misunderstand you, let insults go unanswered, let the version of you that lives in other people's minds drift completely out of your control, what waits for you on the other side of that fear is not the chaos most people expect. It is something else entirely, and it is where this journey turns next. What waits on the other side of that fear is not abandonment. It is not the isolation the untrained mind imagines when it pictures a life free of the need for approval. What waits there is something the ancients called an inner citadel, and almost no one alive today has ever set foot inside one, because almost no one has been taught that it exists. Picture, for a moment, what most people actually carry with them through a single ordinary day. A private unspoken referendum, running constantly in the background of the mind, on whether they are liked, whether they are respected, whether the room they just left thought well of them. This referendum never closes. It reopens with every glance, every tone of voice, every slight delay in a reply. And because it never closes, the sense of self it produces is never stable. It rises and falls with the moods and opinions of people who in most cases spent no real thought on you at all. This is what it means to live with your foundation built outside your own walls. It feels like connection. It is actually exposure. The Stoics understood something the modern world has almost entirely forgotten. A person who requires the good opinion of others in order to feel whole has handed the keys of their own well-being to strangers. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius from a position of wealth and influence that could easily have made him complacent, warned repeatedly against this exact dependency. He had watched men of enormous power reduced to trembling wrecks the moment public favor turned against them, because their entire sense of self had been built on a foundation that belonged to the crowd, not to themselves. He wrote that the same crowd that praises you today can just as easily destroy you tomorrow, and if your peace depends on its verdict, you have built your house on a tide, not on stone. This is a difficult thing to hear, because it asks you to notice how much of your own daily peace has been quietly outsourced to people who will never be held accountable for the damage their opinions do to you. Building an inner citadel does not mean withdrawing from people. It does not mean coldness or isolation or a performance of not caring that is really just another form of caring too much, dressed in armor. It means constructing, deliberately and patiently, an internal sense of worth that does not require ratification from outside sources to remain standing. This is architecture, not attitude. It is built one deliberate choice at a time, the choice to act rightly even when no one is watching to approve of it, the choice to hold to a principle even when holding to it costs you standing in someone else's eyes. The choice to let your own honest judgment of yourself carry more weight than the passing judgment of a stranger who will forget you within the hour. Marcus Aurelius understood this citadel intimately because he ruled from inside a palace built almost entirely of other people's expectations. Senators wanted one version of him, soldiers wanted another, the mob in the streets wanted a third, and all three versions contradicted each other constantly. He could not possibly satisfy all of them, and any ruler who tried would have been paralyzed within a week. So he wrote to himself, in the privacy of his own notebook, a question that cuts through nearly every modern anxiety as cleanly as it cut through his own. What is it exactly in the opinion of others that concerns me? Not the fact of their opinion, the actual substance of it. He noticed, when he examined it honestly, that most opinions people held of him were built on incomplete information, personal insecurity, or simple indifference dressed up as judgment. Once seen clearly, these opinions lost much of their power to disturb him. Not because he stopped caring about being good. He cared about that more than almost anyone in his position ever had. He simply stopped confusing being good with being universally approved of, two things the untrained mind conflates constantly and painfully. There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a person once this citadel begins to take shape. It is not the silence of someone who has given up on being understood. It is the silence of someone who no longer needs to be understood in order to feel steady. Consider how much energy is spent, across a single week, managing other people's impressions, choosing words carefully, not because they are true, but because they are safe, softening opinions not because they have changed, but because disagreement feels dangerous, performing agreeableness in rooms where honesty would have served everyone better. This is not politeness. This is a citadel with no walls, exposed on every side, spending its entire strength on defense instead of purpose. And here is the part that modern psychology has only recently begun to rediscover, though the Stoics knew it 2,000 years ago. The people with the least need for external validation are, paradoxically, the ones who tend to earn the most genuine respect. Not because they are performing confidence, but because the absence of neediness in a person is instantly, if unconsciously, recognizable to everyone around them. People can sense when your steadiness depends on their approval, and something in human nature is drawn to exploit that dependency, consciously or not. But people can equally sense when your steadiness does not depend on them at all, and something in human nature responds to that with a strange, involuntary respect. You cannot manufacture this. You cannot perform it convincingly for long. It has to be real, built stone by stone, in the private moments no one else will ever witness. But building this citadel raises an uncomfortable question, one the ancients themselves wrestled with far more than their calm writings usually let on. If your peace no longer depends on the approval of others, does that mean you stop caring what happens to you at all? Does the inner citadel become a kind of numbness, a fortress so complete that nothing from the outside world can reach you anymore, including the things that should? This is the exact edge where Stoicism is most often misunderstood, mistaken for indifference when it is actually something far more demanding, and it is precisely there, at that edge, that the next rule begins. Does the inner citadel become a fortress so complete that nothing from the outside world can reach you anymore? Does caring less about opinion mean caring less about everything? This is the exact place where Stoicism is most often mistaken for something colder than it actually is, and understanding the difference is what separates a person who has genuinely mastered their emotional life from one who has simply gone numb and called it wisdom. Here is the distinction the ancients drew, carefully and deliberately, though it is almost always lost in the modern retelling of their philosophy. There is a vast difference between not being disturbed by things outside your control and not caring about things outside your control. The first is strength. The second is a kind of quiet cowardice dressed in philosophical language, a way of avoiding the risk of love, effort, and loss by pretending none of it ever mattered in the first place. The Stoics were not advocating for the second. Marcus Aurelius did not stop loving his family because he understood they were mortal. Epictetus did not stop valuing friendship because he understood friends could betray him. What they practiced was something far more difficult than detachment. They practiced full engagement with a world they knew, with total clarity, they could not control the outcome of. Consider the specific texture of this distinction in something ordinary. A person you love deeply, whose health worries you, whose choices sometimes frustrate you, whose future you cannot guarantee no matter how much you wish you could. The untrained response to this reality is either constant anxious grasping, trying to control what cannot be controlled, or a defensive withdrawal, loving less so there will be less to lose. Both responses come from the same root fear. The Stoic response is neither. It is to love completely, to act rightly toward that person with your full attention and effort, while holding underneath all of it a clear and settled understanding that outcomes were never yours to guarantee to begin with. This is not a smaller kind of love. It is, if anything, a braver one, because it removes the illusion of control that so often makes people cling rather than simply love. Epictetus made this distinction with a piece of advice that sounds shocking the first time you hear it, and only reveals its depth on the second or third reading. He said that when you kiss your child goodnight, you should remind yourself that you are kissing a mortal being. Read quickly, this sounds cold, almost cruel. Read slowly, it reveals itself as the opposite. He was not suggesting you love your child less. He was suggesting that remembering mortality, remembering that nothing external is permanently guaranteed to you, actually deepens the appreciation of the moment you are in, rather than shrinking it. The parent who forgets this truth takes the goodnight kiss for granted, assumes an infinite supply of future evenings, and often fails to notice the present one at all. The parent who remembers it is fully present for exactly the moment they are actually in, because they understand without morbidity that presence is the only guarantee they were ever given. This is the real function of the dichotomy of control. Once it matures past its early, simpler lessons, In its early form, it teaches you not to be disturbed by an insult or a stranger's opinion, and this is valuable, but it is only the entry point. In its mature form, it teaches you to distinguish in every single situation life presents you with between the portion that is yours to shape through effort, virtue, and choice, and the portion that belongs entirely to fortune, other people, or time. Your effort is always yours. The outcome of that effort is almost never entirely yours. A physician can practice medicine with total skill and total care, and still lose a patient to something beyond anyone's power to prevent. Does this mean the physician's effort was wasted or worthless? Nothing about the Stoic framework suggests this. It suggests the opposite, that the effort itself was the entire point, complete and valuable, regardless of what fortune decided to do with it afterward. This reframing changes something fundamental about how a person moves through failure and disappointment. Most people measure their own worth by outcomes they never fully controlled to begin with. A job they did not get, a relationship that ended despite real effort, a plan that collapsed for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of the planning. And so they walk through life accumulating a private, silent tally of failures that were never truly theirs, judging themselves for a scoreboard rigged from the very start with variables no human being could have managed. The Stoic asks a different question after every outcome, good or bad. Not did I win, but did I act with the wisdom, courage, justice, and self-control available to me at the time? This question is always answerable. It is always within reach. And a life measured by this question, rather than by the unpredictable verdicts of fortune, produces a very specific kind of steadiness. Not because good things always happen, but because the measure of a life well lived no longer depends on them happening at all. There is, however, one final threshold left to cross, and it is the hardest one of all because it does not ask you to manage your reaction to insults, or your need for approval, or even your attachment to outcomes. It asks you to face the one thing every human being spends most of their waking life trying not to think about directly, the one fact beneath every fear this journey has touched so far, and to look at it not with dread, but with something closer to gratitude. The one fact beneath every fear this journey has touched so far is death. And the strange truth the Stoics discovered is that facing it directly does not darken a life. It illuminates one. Most people spend their entire existence organizing their behavior around an unspoken denial. They plan as though time were infinite, postpone as though tomorrow were guaranteed, and quarrel over trivial slights as though there would always be another day to repair the damage. This denial is not stupidity. It is a kind of psychological anesthesia, a way of numbing the one fact too enormous for the mind to hold comfortably in view for very long. But the Stoics understood something almost every modern person avoids. This anesthesia does not protect you from death. It simply steals the urgency, the attention, and the gratitude that an honest relationship with mortality would otherwise give you. Marcus Aurelius kept the fact of his own death in near constant view, not out of morbidity, but as a discipline aimed directly at improving the quality of the hours he actually had. He reminded himself that he could leave this life right now, and let that fact govern what he thought, said, and did, rather than letting the illusion of endless time govern them instead. This was not despair. It was clarity. A man who genuinely believes he might not see tomorrow does not waste today on petty grievances, on rehearsed resentments, on the performance of being understood by people who were never going to understand him. He spends it on what actually matters, because the false comfort of infinite time has been stripped away, and what remains is simply the truth of the moment he is standing in. Consider how differently a single ordinary day unfolds under this awareness. The argument that felt urgent an hour ago suddenly reveals itself as a rehearsal for nothing, since neither participant is guaranteed the decades of resentment they were unconsciously planning to nurse over it. The apology you have been delaying, waiting for the perfect moment that keeps failing to arrive, suddenly cannot wait any longer, because there is no evidence that a more perfect moment is coming. The person you love, sitting across the table from you at this exact moment, is suddenly not a permanent fixture of your life to be taken for granted between more interesting distractions, but a finite, fragile presence deserving your full and undivided attention while you still have it to give. None of this requires despair. All of it requires honesty. This is the final and most demanding form of the discipline this entire journey has been building toward. Not learning to withstand a single insult without needing to explain yourself. Not learning to widen the gap between impulse and reaction. Not learning to build an inner citadel immune to the shifting opinions of a crowd. Not even learning to love fully while releasing your grip on outcomes you never controlled. All of those disciplines were preparation for this one, because none of them can be sustained by willpower alone over the length of an entire life. They can only be sustained by a person who has made honest peace with the fact that the life containing all of it is not permanent, and who has let that peace transform obligation into gratitude. The Stoics called this practice memento mori. Remember that you will die, and it is perhaps the most misunderstood phrase in the entire philosophy because it sounds on first hearing like a summons to despair. It is the opposite. It is a summons to attention. Seneca wrote that it is not that we have so little time, but that we waste so much of it, that life is long enough if you know how to use it. The problem was never the length of the days. The problem was the distraction, the postponement, the quiet assumption that the present moment could always be exchanged later for a better one. Memento mori dissolves that assumption entirely. It insists, gently but relentlessly, that this moment, the one happening right now, is not a rehearsal for some more important moment still to come. It is the entire performance, the only one you will ever be given, and it is already underway. What emerges from all 5 of these disciplines taken together is not a person who feels less. It is a person who feels everything more fully, precisely because they have stopped wasting their emotional energy on what was never theirs to control in the first place. The silence that no longer needs to explain itself. The gap that no longer reacts on command. The citadel that no longer trembles at the crowd's changing verdict. The love that holds fully without demanding permanence. And beneath all of it, the quiet, clear-eyed awareness that none of this lasts forever, which is not a tragedy to be avoided, but the very reason any of it matters at all. This is not emotional weakness destroyed by force. It is emotional weakness dissolved by understanding, replaced by something that no crowd, no insult, no misfortune, and no ending can ever fully take away.